Hello all, in this video I'm making myself a new Battlefield chessboard from a very curly black walnut log which I inherited from my great-grandfather. The log came from my family's property and my great-grandfather was also a woodworker, so I really wanted to make sure that I used the wood for something meaningful and beautiful. Unfortunately, my great-grandfather passed away before we could really work on something together, so I can't turn the log into something that would be really meaningful for the two of us, but I think turning it into the thing I'm most proud of as a woodworker that will definitely showcase the wood is the next best thing. Because the log is a log, I milled it on my bandsaw to the rough dimensions I need for the dark spaces and the pieces of a Battlefield chessboard. I didn't record the milling because I didn't really know what I was doing, but ended up doing a pretty good job. I could have gotten myself some more usable material had I thought it through some more, but I at least got what I needed for this. At this point you're probably wondering what the heck a Battlefield chessboard even is. That and the thumbnail are probably the only reasons you clicked on this video in the first place. A Battlefield chessboard is a concept I came up with that is basically what got me into woodworking. 8 or so years ago I had the idea for a chessboard grid being part of a natural piece of wood. My first attempt at that was just awful, but it did force me to think of other ways to go about the core concept of my idea, which was to simply have a non-flat surface to more accurately portray the chessboard as a battlefield. What's currently on the screen is my second attempt, which resembles some chessboards you'll find if you search 3D chessboard on Etsy. This one I don't hate, but it also didn't scratch the creative itch, so I learned how regular chessboards are made and decided to build mine like that, and then power carve the terrain out of the board. After milling the log, the lumber is in a rough state, so my first two steps are to surface the boards. I do have a planer, but I don't have a jointer, so I use my router sled to joint one face of the boards. Then because I'm already set up on the sled, and the planer is a hassle to set up in my tiny shop, I use the sled to flatten the other side as well. These are the steps you saw me doing in the beginning of the video. With two flattened parallel sides, I take the boards over to the table saw. Again, I don't have a jointer, so I basically make an extended fence on the table saw that supports the same points along the board's edge throughout the cut, effectively simulating a straight edge. Once that cut is made, I can spin the board around and use the standard table saw fence to make the other side parallel. With all of that done, I still need to get the thickness of the boards down to be just under 2 inches because the maple that I'll be using for the light side of the chessboard will be 8/4 stock from Hughes hardwood. Had I been more thoughtful and confident with the milling of the log, I wouldn't need to perform this step and potentially waste these thin strips of wood. Fortunately, I need material about this size and thickness for the frame of the chessboard, so it worked out. After this step, the walnut is in basically the same state as the maple and the fun can really begin. I say fun, but I also mean terror because I really only get one shot at this. Like I said earlier, I inherited this black walnut, so not only is it beautiful wood, it's sentimental. If I make a bad enough mistake with this chessboard, there's no going back and I'll feel terrible. Next up, I'm just breaking down the maple into 21-inch lengths. The step after this is to cut the maple and the walnut into 2 1/4-inch strips. I made a mistake on this step and encountered a substantial issue though. The mistake I made was cutting the first couple strips down to 2 1/8 because I forgot that I'll need to run the edges through the planer to make them good enough to glue together. The issue I encountered was that my thin kerf blade had a weird slow wobble thing going on. It deformed enough that it walked in one direction a little bit and then snapped back into place, and this resulted in a horrible cut. Fortunately, I started with the maple so I didn't waste any of the walnut, and I have enough extra maple that I don't need to go buy more. These first couple cuts on the table saw are simply to make the edges of each board parallel to each other so that I can utilize a featherboard for the remaining cuts. For all those remaining cuts, I forgot to put the memory card back into the GoPro, so here's me cutting a couple 2x4s to the same width to act as sacrificial boards to use with the planer to prevent snipe, but without the featherboard for some reason. There are a bunch of things you can do to reduce snipe, but on my style of planer it can't be completely eliminated without sacrificial boards, and I need 0 snipe since what I'll be planing is the glue joints for the strips. I'm planing the glue joints because I simply don't trust the table saw to make a glue-ready surface on such thick stock. Speaking of planing, I got my girlfriend's help because without her, this process makes me a bit frantic. Without her help, I have to continuously feed all of the boards without any gaps in between, while also moving the plane boards so they don't fall on the ground. With her help, I simply have to continuously feed all the boards. For the glue up, I did a dry run and decided to go without clamping calls because I wanted to make sure that I let all of the gaps close completely, and I worried that if there's imperfections in the joint, calls might force those to stay open. In the dry run, the boards didn't stay flush, but they were close enough that I was comfortable because I have enough material that I could just flatten one side after this step. Unfortunately, with the glue, the pieces slid up and down a lot more, so I had to slap on some calls in a panic, retighten the clamps, and then remove the calls so they didn't get glued to the board. I doubt you really want to watch all of that, so we'll just skip ahead a bit. You might have noticed that I'm using my lathe bed and that I laid down some parchment paper prior to laying down the wood. I'm using the bed of the lathe to do this because it's a nice flat surface that allows me to relatively easily get clamps everywhere I need them. The idea behind the parchment paper was to protect the lathe bed from the glue, however, you're about to see that this didn't work as well as I'd hoped.
Huh. That sucks.
After getting the clamps off, I found rust where the glue lines were. I'm not sure if moisture got through the parchment paper or if the glue caused some condensation. Whatever the case, I was able to remove the rust and most of the color with some steel wool and mineral spirits. I mentioned that there was a lot of vertical sliding during the glue up and that I need to flatten one side. I did this with the router sled, but you don't get to see it because I experimented with the new camera angle by mounting it directly to the sled. This was a terrible idea and I got a little nauseated just watching 10 seconds of it. Prior to cross-cutting the new strips on the table saw, I cut one edge to be perfectly straight and square to the side using my crosscut sled. This gives me something to reference against the fence of the table saw. Also, prior to cutting the new strips, I glue some strips to the sides of the current board. These are a sacrifice to the planing gauze to allow me to run each new strip through the planer without getting chip out at the ends. I'm doing this on this set of strips and not the first because this time it's the end grain that will be getting planed. You might notice that some of the glue looked nasty. This is some old glue that I accidentally let get too hot or too cold at some point, so it's funky and I don't trust it for important things, but it should be good enough for this. The issue I mentioned previously with the thin kerf blade was addressed by getting a fancy new expensive full kerf blade. I got a super combination blade from Ridge Carbide. It's expensive, but between it and the 3 horsepower table saw, it cuts like a hot knife through butter. After the first cut or two, I sped up my feed rate and the cuts were still effortless. With how amazing those cuts were, I don't think I'll need the planer step in the future, however those cuts did cause an issue which I'll discuss later. For the next round of planing, I decided to take off a tiny amount of material at a time because I've heard horror stories about end grain exploding when running through the planer. Personally, I've only experienced major chip out at the infeed end of the board, but I didn't really want to break any of the strips, so I just took a small amount of material off with each pass and made about 4 times as many passes as before. The next thing I wanted to do was cut off the sacrificial strips. In order to do this, I had to sand off some of the tear out because some of it was protruding past the edge, causing the strip to not sit flat against the crosscut sled. With the new strips now sitting flat against the crosscut sled, I could carefully align and cut off the sacrificial bits. However, this step really could have waited until I had glued everything together, allowing me to just make 2 cuts to remove these bits. I regret doing them one at a time. Don't follow my lead on this one. It took an extra long time because I had to wait for the saw to stop after every cut in order to line up the next cut. Because of how long it took, we're just going to skip ahead to the next step. That next step is the final glue up. However, I do this one strip at a time so I can make sure I have enough time to perfectly line up the 2 mating strips. I've had issues in the past with the alignment of the corners, and this is one of the things I do to try to mitigate that. That being said, there is still a corner alignment issue, which is what I alluded to earlier when I said that the table saw cuts did end up causing an issue. The way the cuts caused the issue is actually pretty peculiar to me. I used a digital angle finder to ensure my blade was 90 degrees to my table. However, after gluing the first few strips together, I found that there were corner alignment issues on the underside of the board. This is due to the blade not being 90 to the table, so I double checked my blade alignment and found that it actually was. After some confusion, I put the angle finder on the right side of the blade instead of the left and found that it was 90.4 degrees. Every single test with the angle finder yielded the same results, but I eventually got myself a nice enough combination square and found that the angle finder was wrong. I do not understand how it could be so consistently wrong, but that seems to be the case. With this chessboard, I'm currently pretty nervous because although the top is perfect, I'm going to be removing material from the top in various places, and I know that the more material I remove, the worse the corner alignment will become. If this chessboard were for someone else, I would do the power carving to see how bad the corner alignment is and have to start all over if it were bad enough. Because this chessboard is for me though, I'll be able to live with some bad corner alignment, but I'll definitely be bothered by it, so I hope it's pretty minimal. I had some issues gluing up the first couple strips, but eventually the process I landed on is the following. Step 1. Lay down a thick piece of aluminum or aluminium for the British folks out there between the wood and the lathe bed. Step 2. Clamp the main piece to the aluminum. Step 3. Align the new strip to the main piece and clamp it to the aluminum. Step 4. Mark several lines across the glue joint to reference after applying the glue. Step 5. Remove the new strip, then apply and spread wood glue to its surface. Step 6. Rub some low grit sandpaper together above the glue so that a little bit of grit falls onto the wood. Step 7. Align the new strip to the main piece and carefully clamp it to the aluminum. Clamping it to the aluminum will help prevent the pieces from sliding around. Step 8. Add some sacrificial blocks to each side of the board and clamp it all together, carefully checking the alignment and making any necessary adjustments. Between the added grit and the clamping the wood to the aluminum, the adjustment portion is very brief. What you see me working with now is plywood. The reason I'm working with plywood now is that I basically glue the entire chessboard to some 3/4 inch Baltic birch. This helps prevent wood movement from breaking apart the chessboard. This is going to be much more effective with a regular thinner chessboard, but it's pretty much the only thing I could think to do to try to prevent that issue. To prepare the plywood, I need to get it to be slightly larger than the chessboard, and I also need to get it flat. Ideally, the plywood is already flat, but I don't have a place to store it to keep it perfectly flat after initially buying it, so I need to remove a little material to make it flat again. The actual flattening is kind of tedious and probably boring to watch, and I flatten stuff with the router sled in almost every video I make, so we'll skip the flattening step here. Oh look, more flattening. I just said I won't make you watch all the flattening, but I will say right now that I'm flattening this one surface so that it can be glued to the plywood. Earlier I mentioned that the corner alignment on the underside was pretty bad. This is what I was referring to. Unfortunately, after flattening the top, I've found that despite my best efforts, the corner alignment on top isn't perfect either. This really sucks because, like I mentioned early on, I only get one shot with this wood. The alignment isn't so bad that I'm going to trash it, but it's going to bother me more than I'd hoped. The next step is to glue the chessboard to the plywood. I wasted a bunch of time trying to get the two edges flush with each other, but even with the sanding grit trick, that proved to be impossible. To save you from watching that nonsense for too long, I super sped up that struggle portion. Once I finally gave up on that alignment, it was a pretty straightforward process since the plywood was oversized. The blocks you see me clamping across the middle are very important though. This is going to help distribute the clamping pressure and ensure that the center is actually pressed together. With the chessboard glued to the plywood, I just need to trim off the plywood prior to the power carving. Because I didn't get two edges perfectly aligned, I needed to carefully place the chessboard on the crosscut sled to make sure the edge I'm cutting is perpendicular to the fence. To do this safely, I aligned the board and then stuck a little wedge between the board and the fence where a gap was created. Once I get that first edge flush, trimming the rest is pretty easy. I still needed to be careful to not remove material from the board itself though. To do that, I just made multiple cuts, scooting the board a tiny bit closer to the blade each time. I'm clearly not very skilled with 3D modeling tools, but I do like to give myself a rough idea of the terrain I'm going to make by utilizing SketchUp. This is what I'm going for, and to help me achieve this through power carving, I made a little template to kind of resemble the edges of the terrain. To utilize the template, I get the bottom flush with the bottom of the chessboard and then simply transfer lines to the side of the chessboard. This way when I'm power carving, I have something to aim for. You may have noticed that in SketchUp, the 4 spaces in the middle of the chessboard are the highest, and there's a low point between those spaces and the royals on the edge. This isn't something I can account for with the template, but the center 4 spaces are pretty easy. I just don't touch those, and the low point will be a little trickier, but the way I'll make sure that's symmetrical is to eyeball one side and then use a router sled to measure down from the top for the other side to make sure it matches the first side. The next step is one of my favorites. It's time consuming and kinda hard on the back, but I love carving the terrain out of the chessboard because that's what makes my Battlefield chessboard so unique. The way I'm carving this terrain is with a very coarse cut-saw shaping dish on an angle grinder. After watching other YouTubers, I thought that this would make the process so quick that I originally was worried about quickly destroying the board. Fortunately, that's not the case. It's actually very easy to control and doesn't remove material too quickly. However, as you may have gleaned from the time-lapse already, it's a very long process. Despite it being very easy to control though, I do think it's still terrifying wielding the Flesh Remover 12,000, so I always have a strong grip and make sure to not let any clothing get too close to the dish. To achieve the terrain I want, I start by removing material on the edges to get close to the lines that I drew earlier. Once all of the edges are close to those lines, I start working my way inward. The way I work the rest of the board is a little haphazard. Basically, I know there's going to be a valley between the royals and the center of the board, so my main focus is to remove material from the valley area and the inner side of the royal spaces. I was originally hoping to leave the 4 spaces in the center untouched, but as I created the valley, I realized that the slope on the center side is so steep that 2 tall chess pieces may touch each other if one is in the valley and the other is on that slope. Even recording in time-lapse and speeding up that time-lapse, there's still a lot of power carving video to go. Between that and the fact that there's not much left to explain, I'm going to stop talking now and turn up the classical music for the rest of the power carving. I personally would like to see the transformation, so I would keep watching, but I won't be offended if you skip to the next chapter of the video. Alrighty, from here on, even with the time lapse, it's hard to see the transformation because I stop and start frequently to check progress and then make small adjustments. I also take the board inside the house and stare at it for a day to determine what needs to be changed, but again, each adjustment is small, so we can move on to the sanding portion. I don't often show much of my sanding because I hate doing it, I hate recording it, and I don't think it's really entertaining to watch. However, I wanted to show some of it this time because this is such a non-standard thing to sand. I probably should have started recording sanding a bit earlier because there's a lot of leveling that happens with the 40 to 60 grit, but we're starting here instead. At this point, most of the board is leveled and I just need to sand through the grits. However, even with the soft pad on the orbital sander, the orbital can't really be trusted to not leave swirl marks, so I do all of the sanding by hand. When sanding this by hand, I mark up the entire board with a pencil first to make sure I don't miss any spots, which is very easy to do on this wavy surface. What's more, there could still be low points that don't really get hit by the sanding pad. If there's a stubborn pencil mark that doesn't seem to sand away, there's a good chance that is a low point which still needs to be leveled out. It's important you catch all of these spots with the 80 grit. If you don't find it until a higher grit, you'll have a heck of a time sanding it out later. Once you get through the 80 grit, it should just be a matter of sanding through the grits. However, I don't want to risk not sanding out scratches from prior grits, so I do each grit twice. Also, I only sand up to 180 and save 220 and 320 for later because the steps after this leave pencil marks and maybe a little more on the board. The reason I do some sanding before the following steps is that the purpose of the following steps is to drill the holes for the magnets. I don't want to sand away too much material or unevenly sand away material after the holes for the magnets are drilled because I don't want to accidentally expose the magnet holes or alter the strength of some but not all of the spaces. The next step is marking the center of every space, which is crucial for drilling the holes for the magnets. The reason I'm marking the centers on the surface will make sense when I actually begin to drill the holes. With the surface being wavy, I use a flexible feeler gauge, line it up from corner to corner, and mark a line. This next step was a lot less fun than I anticipated. What I'm doing is cutting up a sheet of plastic, which is harder than I thought it would be, and that is because it didn't cut or break as easily as I expected. The first attempt broke unevenly, so I had to make multiple passes with the razor for every cut. However, once I was close to done, I realized that with just one pass I could make a clean break if I flexed the plastic the opposite direction of that first uneven break. You might be wondering why I'm messing around with plastic at all. The reason is to protect the surface of the wood. Why the surface needs protecting will make sense after the next step. That next step is just to hot glue the plastic squares to the surface of the chessboard. This is pretty straightforward, but I will mention now that I needed clear plastic and couldn't use double-sided tape or press the plastic onto a dab of hot glue because I need to be able to see the center of each space and do it without creating an inconsistent distance between the surface of the wood and the surface of the plastic. Another reason for not using double-sided tape is that double-sided tape in my experience allows for some side-to-side shifting, which wouldn't be acceptable here. We're finally ready to drill the holes for the magnets, so those last several steps should begin to make sense. Using the riser post, a depth stop, and flipping the chessboard upside down allows me to drill through the bottom of the chessboard to a specific point, which is a set distance from the surface of the board. This ensures that even if the board is not perpendicular to the drill bit, then the bottom of each hole will be centered in each space and a consistent distance from the surface. The only risk is that the hole is angled, but being a little angled doesn't seem to affect the magnet strength. I added the plastic on the surface of the wood because of the way the riser post works. I'm using a drill bit as the point that I place the center of each space on. The plastic protects the wood so that the pilot point of the drill bit doesn't generate a bunch of holes that need to be sanded out. Well, it kind of still does, but they're not as significant, so the sanding is minimal. This process is kind of a pain because I need to very carefully place the tip of the drill bit on the center of the space prior to drilling. A second set of hands helps speed this process up a lot, but it still probably took a good 20 to 30 minutes. One last thing that's worth mentioning about this process is that I bought this drill press specifically for this process. Most cheaper drill presses I looked at when I bought this had a throat depth of like 6 inches. I needed at least 7.5 to be able to drill the holes for the magnets in the spaces closest to the center. So rather than spend a bunch of extra money on a larger drill press, I found this one. That being said, I think I spent like $200 on this at the time, and it's currently $500 plus another $200 for delivery on Amazon. With the holes drilled, I spent a few minutes taking the plastic off of the surface of the chessboard. I used a dull chisel for this, but apparently it wasn't dull enough because I did cause some scratches that will need to be sanded out. So next time I'll use a plastic scraper of some kind. Unfortunately, I also noticed at this point that the chessboard warped some. This is always a risk with this kind of chessboard, but this is the first time it's happened to me. To address it, I'll simply incorporate some concealed leveling feet later on. This next part is one of the most satisfying for me, and that's installing the magnets. This is a two-stage process. The first stage is simply slipping the magnets in after making sure you have the orientation correct or at least consistent. I like to try to get the polarity of the magnets and all my boards to be the same as each other, so I'm using an old chess piece to orient my magnets. The second stage is inserting some cylindrical foam weather stripping that's roughly the same diameter of the holes. This allows me to test the polarity and the strength of all the magnets prior to permanently installing them. It may not be obvious in the time lapse, but that definitely saved me this time because one of the magnet holes wasn't deep enough, so I had to take the chessboard back out to the drill press and re-drill the hole. Another issue I had this time is that the drill bit I used for the holes was just a little too big, so the weather stripping was slightly looser than I'd like. This meant that the magnets were allowed to wiggle around during testing. I didn't like that, so I took all the weather stripping out and wrapped just a little bit of masking tape around them and stuck them back in. For some added security, I decided to fill the gaps under the weather stripping with some epoxy paste. This way, if the weather stripping tape combination were to ever fail, the weather stripping wouldn't be able to fall. I could have just drizzled in some thin CA glue, but I think that's a little more permanent than is necessary. Next up, I prepared the wood for the frame. The way I make my frame is a bit unusual. Because the chessboard is already so big and bulky, I make more of a border than a frame. To start this process, I get some 1/4 inch thick boards flattened parallel, then I trace the outline of the chessboard on the pieces, and finally I cut them out on the bandsaw. For these pieces, I like to not cut very close to the line so that I have some wiggle room during the glue up. It's easier to remove material after the glue up than it is to start over if the glue up doesn't go perfectly to plan. Prior to gluing the border in place, I need to deal with the underside of the chessboard so that you only see the border of the chessboard when looking from the side. For the first couple Battlefield chessboards I made, I glued 1/4 inch maple or black walnut to the bottom, but that's a lot of extra money for the bottom of something. While wandering around Macbeth's hardwood one day, I realized there's a cheaper option that doesn't sacrifice aesthetics, and that is veneer, so that's what I'm doing here. Contact cement is pretty cool because you just need to apply it to both surfaces, wait until it dries, and then press the surfaces together. However, it does not spread easily with a brush. I think I'm going to invest in a rubber roller for next time, but for this time, I'm just going to speed up the rest of the application for you guys. You really only get one shot to bond the two surfaces together, so I'm using some spacers to help align the veneer. Since the spacers don't have any contact cement on them, they won't get stuck to either surface.
Well, the board continued to warp after I cut all these border pieces. And so what that means is that this one, which I cut oversized, is now just barely flush with the board in most spots, and in some spots it's a little under, like here. So I'm going to have to reshape the edges of the board to get them to mesh with the border.
The glue up of the border went almost as expected, but the points of the clamps that were touching were higher up than I thought they were, so some gaps opened up on the underside and I had to reposition the clamps a while after the glue dried. This obviously isn't ideal, but I left the clamps on for 24 hours and the gaps on the underside still haven't reopened over a week later, so I think it's going to be okay. Once I was comfortable with the border glue up, I had to reshape the edges of the board to be flush with the board. I did this with 80 grit, and I was very careful doing this to avoid sanding the center of the spaces. If I heavily sanded the center of the spaces, that would make the magnets in those spaces stronger because there would be less space between them and the magnets in the pieces. Once the edges were reshaped, I carefully sanded those areas up to 180 grit and then sanded the entire board from 180 to 320. Because of the warpage, I utilized a flush trim router bit to clean up the underside of the chessboard, and I left the tape on there to help protect the veneer from the bearing on the bit. The next step is hacking off the excess border wood at a 45-degree angle so that I can glue on the corners of the borders. With the corners prepared, I can glue on some maple. However, you may notice on this first corner that my longest clamp is just barely long enough to reach, so I had to get a little creative with the remaining corners. This double clamp method was a little finicky, but it got the job done. I think something important to point out is that I've got the joint side of the clamp on the corners rather than the solid side of the clamp. This ensures a more even clamping pressure distribution. With the corners glued on, I had the pleasure of removing the excess. It was not a pleasure. I used a handsaw, bandsaw, and table saw to remove the excess. I used a handsaw to cut off the excess on the underside of the chessboard, a bandsaw to cut off one side of each corner, and a table saw to cut off the other side of each corner. You might be wondering why I didn't just use a handsaw to cut off all of the excess, and the answer to that is that either I don't have a very good handsaw or I'm not very skilled with a handsaw, so the handsaw work that I did do took forever. With the bulk of the excess removed, I did some sanding to make the corners flush with the rest of the board and then got everything sanded to 320 grit. I know I said I did this already, but it actually didn't happen until after I had the corners in place. Alrighty, the last thing to address prior to finishing is the adjustable feet. For the feet themselves, I just dipped the heads of some bolts into some thinned out plasti dip to rubberize them. I'm not positive yet that this will be durable in the long run, so I may need to strip them and upgrade to flex paste or truck bed liner material or something like that in the future. You might notice that I'm sticking a screwdriver into the head of the bolt. This is to ensure the hole doesn't get filled with plasti dip so that the feet can be adjusted with a screwdriver if necessary. I wanted the feet to be as concealed as possible, so I drilled a hole for the bolt head about a 1/4 inch into the wood near the corners and then followed that up with a narrower hole about 3/4 inch deep to accept the shaft of the bolt. Once that was done, all that was left to do was to cut the threads into the wood using one of the bolts themselves. I originally planned on using a tap to cut the threads, but forgot and ended up not needing a tap. After doing all the sanding and cleanup, the last thing to do is to apply finish. I've said in a prior video that I'm done with polyurethane, but I have yet to find a finish that would be more appropriate for a chessboard, so wipe on poly it is. I've had terrible results with wipe on poly in the past, as well as great results. This time is a bit of a mix. I applied a few coats and was almost happy, but not quite, so I had to sand and recoat several times to get the look and feel that I wanted. This obviously means I'm no expert, so I'm not going to show all of the coats and talk about how I apply it. That means we get to move on to the final product once this clip is done. Before we get there though, I'd like to say that if you want to see more of my videos in the future, I encourage you to like and subscribe. If you really like this Battlefield chessboard concept and plan to make your own, please let me know and share your results. I'd love to see a Battlefield chessboard made by someone else, and I'm interested to know if you come up with different ways of approaching it. If you really like the Battlefield chessboard concept but don't want to make your own, you can place an order on my website, which I'll put in the description below and on screen. As you've seen, this process takes time as well as expensive materials, so every chessboard is custom made. This gives you an opportunity to provide input on the terrain you'd like for the board as well as other aspects. And here's the finished product. I'm including the chess pieces in most of the pictures, but they are from an older build. I will be making chess pieces specifically for this board in the future using the same wood, so keep an eye out for that video. Thanks for watching.